Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Simon Wunderlich, and with me is Professor Thomas Higham. He is a renowned archaeologist and expert in radiocarbon dating and author of The World Before Us, this new science behind our human origins. Now, let me first ask you, what is radiocarbon dating? What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's a way of dating archaeological sites, dating the past, and it was a method that was developed in the 1940s, the late 1940s, and it basically revolves around the idea that a very small amount of the world's carbon is radioactive. When I say a small amount, I'm talking about 1 in a trillion atoms is carbon 14, and so every living organism takes up this carbon 14 through food and through photosynthesis. And because it's radioactive, when any living organism dies, the amount of carbon 14 slowly starts to degrade and disappear back to its parent isotope. And so, as radiocarbon scientists, what we try and do is to measure as precisely as possible how much radiocarbon is left, and then we can calculate the age. So, we can date anything from today back to 50,000 years ago, and it's the most common method used for dating archaeological sites.
Ah, interesting. So when you find bones, for example, you can find out from what century they were.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, bone and charcoal and samples of anything organic. Uh, we could date a whole range of different things, and so yeah, it's the most common method of working out how old something is from the ancient past.
Huh. So that's how you find out the time period. But
Yeah,
when finding out about different human types, for example, how can one
yeah.
identify what type it is?
Yes, so there are two main ways of doing that. The first is looking at the physical appearance, the physical anthropology of ancient remains, like skulls and post-cranial bones. And so we know, for example, since the early 1800s, that we were not the only humans that have lived on the planet Earth. There were others, and the first really to be described scientifically were the Neanderthals. And when we look at a Neanderthal skull, like this one up here that I've got, there are differences between us and Neanderthals, quite pronounced differences in terms of the physical appearance. So one way of identifying um, other humans in the fossil record is physical anthropology, and the other way, which has only been a thing, I guess, for the last 16 or 17 years, is extracting ancient DNA from bone and teeth and so on. And scientists have discovered that if you look at the genetic sequences, the genetic code of a Homo sapiens, and you compare it to a Neanderthal, very, very similar, but there are some specific differences. And so we're able to identify based on DNA whether a bone is from a Neanderthal or from a human, a Homo sapiens like us, based on the nuclear and the mitochondrial DNA that we extract in ancient DNA labs.
But there were other human species besides Neanderthals and the now humans out there, right? What other were there?
Indeed, indeed. Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. If you want to go back to sort of the beginning of the split between the ancestors of humans and the chimpanzee ancestor, you go back between 6 to 12 million years, and then you find these organisms called Australopithecines, who we find on the fossil record from as far back as 4.5 million years ago. My interest is mainly in the genus Homo, us, and the earliest members of the genus Homo go back to just over 2 million years ago. And then we see this very complex picture of lots of different types of different forms of Homo, over the next 2 million years. But it's only until the last 300,000 years that we find human remains that look and have the same appearance that we do, and that is in Africa. All of these humans and human ancestors seem to originally appear in Africa, and over the course of many hundreds of thousands of years, periodically they move out of Africa and uh, into the rest of the world, principally into Eurasia. So we've had many years of archaeological research and excavation and so on that have produced many thousands of human bones. And so we've got a pretty good idea of the breadth of humanity. And the fact is that there are a lot of different human ancestors on the planet through the course of the last, as I say, several million years. But in terms of the genus Homo, over the last 300,000 years, there are lots of different types of Homo that we find in the archaeological record, which makes it a very fascinating, but at the same time, a complicated story.
Is an estimate of how many?
Yeah, so we've got we've got us, we've got Neanderthals. In island Southeast Asia, in the last few years, have been discovered Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, and then we have Homo luzonensis, who lived on the islands of the Philippines, and then we've probably got Homo erectus, which is a very ancient human lineage, but it seems to have survived up until perhaps 100,000 years ago. In the south of Africa, we've got Homo naledi, which was discovered in 2013, which seemingly lived in South Africa. And then we have this very interesting and enigmatic group called the Denisovans, which were sort of Neanderthal relatives that lived in Eastern Eurasia. So we're up to 7 now. I think it's likely that there are several more that we haven't discovered yet. And that's because we now would expect to find more on islands where human groups tend to become isolated and then evolve in their own different direction, rather like the hobbits did on the island of Flores and Homo luzonensis did on the island of the Philippines. And then we have genetic evidence that suggests that there are some DNA lineages out there that we can't attach to ancient human remains. So I think it's likely that there are maybe 2, 3, 4, even more humans that we haven't met yet out there in the fossil record, which makes it, again, very exciting. If you're a young scientist and you're a young researcher interested in paleoanthropology, you could be the person that goes out and finds these things. And wouldn't that be exciting for science?
And how similar were they?
So quite dissimilar in some respects. So, for example, if you take the hobbits, this is the skull of a hobbit. It's a scan of a reconstruction of a hobbit, and you can see the size of the skull compared to me. These people were just over a meter tall, very, very short, very, very small skulls. You could think of my skull, the skull of a living human would be of the order of 1,800 to 2,000 cubic centimeters, probably a bit more than that. These guys only 400, so very, very small. So very different from us.
Probably why they're called hobbits, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the same for Homo luzonensis, very small as well. And Neanderthals, short, stocky, rather robust, large brow ridges, no chin, wide nasal passages, several things that we can see are distinct and different. And so, we talk about hobbits. Well, if you imagine the Lord of the Rings and all of the different types of people we see in the Lord of the Rings, you can make these comparisons, and I think they're not entirely out of place. Humanity was complicated. Now it's just us, and it's unusual for it to be just one species of Homo. For millions of years there were many different groups living contemporaneously, and now it's just us. And it's only in the last sort of 35 to 40,000 years that it's just been us, and it's a very unusual time to just have one species of Homo left.
And why are we now the only one left?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a question that has puzzled literally generations of scientists as to why. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, I guess, and more recently too, many researchers believe, for example, that groups like the Neanderthals disappeared because they simply weren't as capable as we were. But subsequently, archaeological evidence has shown that Neanderthals were very well adapted and a successful species who lasted for, almost 500,000 years in Europe and Eurasia. And so the idea that they should suddenly disappear was, again, a matter of some uncertainty. I think that some of the most important evidence is revealed by genetics, and the DNA work that's been done on Neanderthal bones and other remains shows that in terms of their population size, they were probably quite small. There may have been no more than 5,000 to 6,000 Neanderthals living at any one time in Eurasia. And I think that what this is significant, why is this is significant, is because as early Homo sapiens were coming out of Africa and spreading, we think that they were present in much larger numbers. And so I think it's increasingly likely that Neanderthals may have become assimilated into those populations. They may have become incorporated within the larger meta population. We know they interbred with one another, so we know that they had contact. But rather than a sort of extinction brought on by a superior group or a group in large numbers, I think it's equally likely that that there was an assimilation and those people moved in and became part of the wider human population. In terms of other groups, we really don't know. But for example, we mentioned before the hobbits, Flores. This was a small population on a single island, and I think it's not surprising to imagine that incoming groups of Homo sapiens there were just too many of them, and they disappeared fairly quickly from the biological story. The same probably goes for Homo luzonensis. Denisovans are a different case in point. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that there were multiple populations of Denisovans, and also that Homo sapiens groups interbred with those populations quite regularly and over quite a long period of time, perhaps as recently as 20,000 years ago. So I think perhaps that Denisovans may have been a different kind of story of disappearance. But again, there is so much we just don't know. The fossil record is very fragmentary, and we still have a lot of work to do before we can really understand the chronology of all of these disappearances and why then they may have occurred in the past.
Can we tell what type of characteristics we may have from them or from the Neanderthals?
Yes, we have a lot of evidence from again from the genetics. The DNA evidence has been really informative, and we now are tracking some of the differences that we have in our genomes between the two or the three groups that we have reliable nuclear DNA evidence from. And so, for example, if you take the Denisovans, we know that there are some really important immunological adaptations that they had compared to us. They had a lot of gene variants that conferred advantages in terms of being able to withstand perhaps pathogens, illnesses, viruses, and diseases in tropical environments. So we think they were quite adapted to the tropical biomes of the world, particularly in places like Island, Southeast Asia, and Melanesia. So that was quite significant. We know that Neanderthals gave us some DNA that codes for various things like improved quality of skin, hair, collagen, and so on. So we have evidence that perhaps Neanderthals were quite well adapted to colder environments, and perhaps this gave us some benefit when we interbred with them. But we also know that we have some deleterious or negative genetic inheritances as well. So, for example, with Neanderthals, we know that they gave us genes that are linked with type 2 diabetes, with addictive behaviors, like, for example, smoking addictions, for specific illnesses that obviously aren't beneficial to us. So there's a lot of work being done at the moment in looking at these differences. And skull shapes, we have evidence that Neanderthal skull shapes live on in groups and populations of living people today. So there's a lot of stuff that we're just at the beginning of understanding, and it's a very exciting time to be working in this field because of the insights it gives us into what they were like compared to what we are currently like after having met these groups and interbred with them and inherited some of their DNA.
Not to become too scientific, because then I can't follow. But how do we know what part of the DNA is from them and what is from
Yeah,
other species?
yeah. So it's all to do with the long tracts of DNA that are sequenced in laboratories now. There's been an incredible revolution in our ability to sequence large amounts of DNA. In the old days, it was very, very difficult to get DNA sequences that could be relied upon as being from the bone of a Neanderthal, for example, or from the bone of an ancient human. And this is because of the overwhelming problems and challenges of contamination of DNA. Most of the DNA you get is in the lab is from bacteria. It's not from the human. And so a series of revolutions took place in terms of instrumentation and the chemical preparation work that was able to be done in DNA labs, which meant that it was now possible to get huge amounts of authentic DNA. And so what you get is these long stretches of millions and millions of codes, letters that correlate to the bases of the genetic code, which gives instruction to life. And so it's a numbers game. Bioinformaticians look at all these numbers, they align them, and they compare specific parts of the genome and the differences. So it's possible to look very closely along the line of these 3.2 billion base pairs and find the differences in terms of these single bases that are expressed between us and between a Neanderthal. And then, based on where they are in the genome, to figure out what that means in terms of the gene, the alleles, and what that is in terms of reflecting behavior, physical appearance, and so on and so forth. So we know a lot about genes now from the Human Genome Project. We can figure out, which gene codes for this and what genes make us look like we look, and so on. And so it's possible to focus on these variable regions of the genome where we know what these genes function, what the gene function is, and compare it to Neanderthals and work out why we're different and how we're different. And so it's really fascinating. A lot of scientists are working now on understanding more about the differences in these genes and the function and what they might give us. And people have been, for example, growing kind of proto brains and inserting Neanderthal genes and alleles into certain parts of these proto brains to see how they impact on the development of brain tissue, for example. And so we can understand how a Neanderthal might have been different cognitively, perhaps, from a Homo sapiens. So there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment to understand the sort of nuts and bolts of how all this works in reality.
That is so amazing to me that is possible. So detailed
Yeah,
with the back.
yeah, I know. It is really amazing. I'll give you a really cool example. We have this gene called FOXP2. It's like without this gene, you can't really speak. Speech is very, very difficult without it. And so it turns out that Neanderthals have this FOXP2 gene as well. This part of this variant of FOXP2. And as I say, without it, it's not possible to be able to communicate effectively. So in order to understand the effect of FOXP2, you can use a mouse and you can use gene knockout treatments to put the human FOXP2 into a mouse to see how it reacts and what it does, what the effect is. And it turns out that when you give a mouse the human version of FOXP2, it turns out that there is a definitive change in the length to which they squeak, for example. So it's
Really?
just an example of how you can work out what the impact is of a change in the genetic fingerprint, I guess, of a human or a Neanderthal can have in real terms, and understand more about the makeup of our DNA and their DNA and how it's different and what that in fact gives us in
So it
terms
makes
of
for more
difference.
complex and detailed communication, and therefore
Yeah,
longer
yeah, exactly. It
squeaks.
could be something significant, and there are lots of these differences that we now want to understand more about. So I hasten to say I'm not a geneticist. I wish I was sometimes, but I try and follow the science as closely as I can.
That's super interesting. If when Neanderthals and then now humans interbreded,
Hmm.
did they also live in the same tribes? Did they live together?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's so difficult to know the answer. Um, Back in 2014, we published a big study in which we looked at the dates of Neanderthal archaeological sites and modern human or Homo sapiens archaeological sites. And we found that the distribution was kind of a mosaic. These two groups overlapped in time for several thousand years, which was a big surprise to us. So we think that there were different groups in different parts of Eurasia and that they didn't live in the same site at all times. Otherwise, we'd find their remains sort of commingled together, and we don't always do that. We don't find their remains side by side or the definitive, distinctive stone tools mixed up together in the same archaeological site. So, but of course, we do know that they interbred, and to interbreed, you have to be in the same place. I mean, it's impossible not to, right? And so we in 2018, I was part of this discovery of this incredible human bone from a site called Denisova Cave in Russia, in Siberia, which was shown genetically to be the daughter of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. So this was a sort of a hybrid person with the parents coming from two different human groups. It was an incredible discovery, and it made us realize that at this site, people were living at the same time. Neanderthal groups and Denisovans were present in this place at the same time. And later, with the development of incredible new sediment DNA approaches, so it's possible now to extract DNA from sediments from archaeological sites. It's possible to pull out sediments from different human groups from the same archaeological dirt, as it were. And when this has been done, it's been possible to find that sites like Denisova have sometimes Denisovans living, and then Neanderthals coming in later, and then replaced by Denisovans, and then later Neanderthals, and so on. And I think it's not, shouldn't be surprised to expect that at least at some periods there would be both groups present. So I think that the answer to the question is there may have been times when both groups were living at the same place at the same time. But overwhelmingly, we kind of feel from the evidence in the main suggests that it was more a case of one group living at the same site more often than not. They weren't living together, because if they were all together at the same time, their DNA would be the same. There would be a population, and we don't see that. The DNA is distinctive, and we think that they occasionally met and interbred, but for the most part, they were separate.
Makes sense. I have to ask, maybe it's a dumb question, but
No.
These human types, does it mean they developed more or less at the same time from the apes, or were they somewhat developing within each other from another human species?
Yeah. So, well, the story of evolution is all about separation, and when you separate two different populations, they tend to evolve in slightly different ways. And so, for example, for the last 300,000, 500,000 years, you can imagine that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals shared a common ancestor, but at some point they became separated. Neanderthals living in Europe and Eurasia, and Homo sapiens living in Africa. And then eventually, those African Homo sapiens came out of Africa and met up again with Neanderthals, from which they'd been separated from evolutionary for several 100,000 years. But they weren't different enough so that they couldn't interbreed with one another. But they were separate enough so that we could identify the differences in terms of DNA. The Denisovans, as well, have a very much closer relationship with the Neanderthals. So we think that about 400,000 years ago, they split from one another. Denisovans into the east of Eurasia and Neanderthals into predominantly the west of Eurasia.
So why did the modern human spread throughout Europe?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question to answer, because we don't really know the motivations of people. We can only imagine what they are. But generally speaking, we should imagine that that humans are rather like animals, and they respond to changes in climate and environment. They have to subsist, so they have to eat food and they have to hunt. And so it's likely, I think, that with response to climate change and the presence and absence and the movement of like herds of migratory animals, for example, they may have almost inadvertently moved into these places as a function of those two things. So, for example, at the end of about 20,000 years ago, the Earth went through the coldest part of the last glacial cycle, the so-called last glacial maximum. There were huge ice sheets over the northern parts of Europe. The climate was very, 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 very bad, and human populations declined and really suffered until about 13,000, 14,000 years ago, when the climate switched and things began to warm up again. And so we see that the first evidence for humans moving northwards coincides with the movement of animals like deer and horse. We figure, based on this and the archaeological evidence, that humans were following these herds and moving into these new environments because they wanted to eat those animals. I think the same thing probably applies to the movements of Homo sapiens out of Africa and into Eurasia, it was probably a function of similar types of things. The differences between Homo sapiens and other forms of human like Neanderthals, I think, was that because they'd evolved in Africa, and because we see higher carrying capacities of human groups in climate zones where there is a higher degree of warmth and less sort of ice age fluctuation in terms of climate, that there were probably more humans than there were Neanderthals. And so I think as they came out and moved into these new locations and met Neanderthals, that gradually those small Neanderthal populations were broken up, and larger populations of Homo sapiens. It really meant that they were almost it was almost inevitable that they would disappear. They would disappear and be lost, or to be assimilated into those human populations. Certainly, that's what we see today in terms of animal extinctions. We see that as soon as animal populations become isolated from one another and their metapopulation becomes fragmented, they can't maintain the genetic diversity that is so necessary for long-term survival of a population. And I think this is what happened with Neanderthals, at least, and perhaps with other types of humans like Denisovans as well.
Starting off with a new topic, could you explain what ghost populations are?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really fascinating thing. A ghost population, it's like we have a lot of DNA evidence now from living humans. And so we can look through all of those DNA sequences and we can figure out which parts of the sequences align to lost, extinct forms of humans like Neanderthals. And so we can say in our genomes, oh, look, this DNA comes from a Neanderthal and this DNA comes from a Denisovan and so on and so forth. But some of that ancient DNA we can't align to a Neanderthal or a Denisovan. So we call it a ghost lineage, a ghost population, because we don't know where the DNA comes from. Now, it's merely a statistical artifact. It could come from a part of a Neanderthal DNA that we just don't have yet because we haven't sequenced lots of Neanderthals. But at the moment, we call it a ghost lineage or ghost population because it could come from a human that we've never found before, from DNA that is from a human lineage we haven't yet discovered. And so it's tempting to think this could be evidence for a lost, never seen before human, but it could be equally that it comes from a human that we already know about, that just we haven't sequenced that part of the DNA yet.
Ooh, that's interesting as well. I
Yeah,
did like the name for it, ghost
yeah, I
population.
know, me too. In fact, there is a lot of debate about these ghost populations, and if you look at living African populations and their DNA, there are some tracts of DNA in there that we can't identify yet, and it's tempting to think that this could come from a human that's extinct and we haven't got the DNA from yet. So, yeah, stand by. It's very exciting, and you never know, we might be able to reveal another little twist in the story of human origins on this basis.
Do you know Jared Diamond and his book Ganz Germset Seal?
Yes, I do. I read that book.
That's something that it reminded me of, or I came to think about it when you were talking about
Yeah.
modern humans in Europe.
Mm.
Could you maybe, I think you can do it better than me, explain a little bit what the book is about?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I read it, but basically it tries to explain this idea of why it was that certain human populations were able to have the advantage of things like guns and steel, and why it was that other populations, other groups, didn't have those things and suffered greatly when Europeans arrived into, for example, the New World. They brought with them germs that those people didn't have any resistance to, and so they succumbed in huge numbers. And Jared Diamond's got a very environmentally deterministic way of explaining this. He thinks that there were inherent advantages that were bestowed upon certain populations. So, for example, one thing that he says is that if you look at all of the domesticated crops in the world and the wild predecessors of those crops, most of them come from the fertile zones and the Mediterranean zones, the Near East, and so on. And so populations there had a sort of an inbuilt advantage over getting access to those crops, which then allowed them to gain in population, gain in number, and gain in complexity in terms of of social organization, whereas other human populations, for example, in places like I don't know, Australasia and South America, didn't have access to the same innate advantages, and therefore they didn't have the ability to get to steal like they did. So it's an interesting thesis, and it's worth pointing out that there's been a lot of pushback from archaeologists and anthropologists who view a lot of what Jared Diamond proposed as rather simplistic in many respects and environmentally deterministic. And there may well have been other factors that were involved in these types of sort of origins of inequality. So yeah, that's what I would say.
One other thing I took
Yeah.
from the book that I found interesting was
Mm,
that he talked about how in Europe or Eurasia,
mm,
people were. It was easier to spread information and new technologies because there were less
yeah.
differences, because there were less climate zones, so meaning
Yes.
ecological differences. Um,
Yes.
in total, how do you think his theories or his ideas
Yeah.
work together with yours?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that's one thing I did like, I did appreciate that insight. So yes, you're right. It's according to Jared Diamond, it's much easier to travel sort of horizontally in the world than it is to travel vertically. So longitude is more climatically variable than latitude. So it would be easier for someone to travel, let's say, from Portugal to Siberia than it would be to travel from the Cape Town all the way up to the top of Norway, because you're going through so many more climatic zones and it's much more difficult to adapt. So I think that is an idea that holds merit. And what's interesting is that we see that the evidence supporting this in archaeology. So, for example, we had this big surprise in 2007 when it was discovered that Neanderthals had managed to get all the way from Europe right the way across to Central Eurasia to the site of Kladnikov, which is in the Siberian Altai region, just north of Mongolia. And this was a big surprise because we didn't expect this at all. We felt that Neanderthals were much more localized in their distribution. But climate models have suggested that there's a kind of a similarity at some point of 120,000 years ago between the climate and the environment, right the way across the Central Asian ridge, all the way to the Altai. And so it's not surprising that they were able to move there. In other words, they may have been just following game that we're moving along this sort of climate corridor. But it's much more difficult to move, as I say, from north south. And this was one of Jared Diamond's suggestions for the movement of ideas, for the movement of crops, the introduction of different types of farming, and so on and so forth. But I think it's interesting that it does have relevance to more ancient humans as well as to the humans that he was talking about, which was in the last 10,000 years.
Since there are so many different types of fields of research coming into your area, when you
Yeah.
have to think about
Mm,
ancient civilizations, how do you cope with that? How do you?
yeah.
I mean, you can't be an expert in all these fields, right?
No, it's really difficult. You're absolutely right. And the other day, because I'm writing this paper, it's a review article about archaeological science, and when you plot the number of papers that have been published over the last sort of 50 years, you find that the number of publications is increasing dramatically. There are thousands and thousands of publications that come out all the time, and they're increasingly in areas of science that you just don't have any experience of. And so it's really challenging to try and keep on top of what's going on and to keep up to date with everything. There are only a very small number of people I know that they're able to do it. And I think what you have to do is you have to try and work in interdisciplinary teams of researchers. So you have to work with other people. So, for example, where I work here in Vienna, we have ancient genetics specialists. We have experts working in ancient proteomics, sediment DNA, physical anthropology, archaeology, and so on. And you have to work with all of these people to help you to understand and get to grips with what is becoming an increasingly complex science. And one of the things I really enjoyed about writing this book was that I had to read very, very widely to understand everything, because I wanted to get a full picture of what all these different fields of science were saying. So you've got really no choice but to try and understand and get into the fields of ancient DNA and paleoproteomics and others, and try and figure out what the hell they're talking about, and how robust their information is and what it means in terms of the bigger picture of human evolution and our ancient past.
What was the reaction from the scientific community on your book?
Yeah, it's been good, really good. I mean, I've had very good reviews, and a lot of people have given me, good feedback and told me that they're reading it. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in London for my colleague Chris Stringer, who's one of the top paleoanthropologists, and it was great. I met up with a lot of people, including a lot of young researchers who are doing master's degrees and PhDs and so on, and they'd all said that they really liked it and enjoyed it. So yeah, it's been a great experience, and I'm really happy to share some of the work that I've been lucky to be involved in, and also that my colleagues have been working on. Because I think humans generally are really interested in this. They want to know where we came from and how and what happened. And so I think providing a sort of easy to read, hopefully, easy to read and up to date review, particularly of the Denisovans, who were a very new group, I think is hopefully a good thing to do. We need to feed back what we're doing in our universities and research institutions to people who have a genuine interest in this.
Right now, what are you most excited in the field of archaeology?
Oh, I think it's got to be sediment DNA. This is really, really cool.
Yeah.
The fact that you can get DNA, and it's ancient DNA, sometimes tens of thousands of years old, from archaeological, basically dirt, that can tell you, so much. It's really fascinating, and the way the field is moving ahead is incredible. A few months ago, there was a fascinating paper published on a small pendant, a small like ornament, basically a reindeer tooth that was perforated to be probably worn around the neck, and it was excavated by some friends of mine at a site in Siberia, this very famous site now called Denisova Cave. And my colleagues in Leipzig in Germany non-destructively removed some of the surface of the tooth, and they found that they could sequence the DNA of somebody, probably the person who was wearing this tooth. They worked out that it was a woman. They worked out that she had very close genetic relationships to other people living in the wider Siberian area at the same time, around 20,000 years ago. And they could build up a really detailed picture of this person based on their DNA. This was almost certainly a woman who was wearing this thing 20,000 years ago. It's actually stunning that you can do this work, and you can also, as I say, pull DNA out of soil and sediment and figure out who was there, and in many cases how long ago, based on just the DNA. It's fascinating stuff.
Is that what you're currently researching as well?
Yeah, well, we try and work with colleagues to do this work. We have people in our department who are working on sediment DNA. So my team specializes in radiocarbon dating of bone and other organic remains. But we also go to archaeological sites. We take samples of sediment for DNA, and we work with them to figure out if there's any DNA in it, and to find out what types of mammals and animal DNA, but also what kind of humans might have been in there. So we've got a lot of research interests in trying to understand where the Denisovans lived and how their distribution was. And for that, this DNA evidence coming from sediments is going to be an absolute game changer over the next few years.
And now, before we go on to our second segment, which is some rapid fire questions,
Yeah.
let me ask you, is there something I should have asked you that I didn't, or anything else you want to add?
I think we've done quite a good job of covering a lot of ground, actually. Yeah, it's been good. I can't think of anything else, I'm afraid.
I think so too. Then rapid fire questions.
Oh God.
Yeah, more or less rapid fire. I would ask you to
Okay.
answer in round about 2 to 3 sentences. I think you will be able to.
Okay. Here we go.
Okay, are you ready?
Yes.
Note some of these are personal and not
Okay.
to your area of research.
No problem.
Starting with a personal one.
Okay.
If you had a big poster, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it.
Oh.
What would you put on it?
Bloody hell, that's really tough. Well, that's such a tough question. I think if it was to do with work, I think I would put a picture of the beautiful ornament that was found at Denisova Cave, from which DNA was taken, and that might precipitate from people who looked at it some questions. What is that thing? And if they did a search for it, they might find some really fascinating stuff about early human forms of adornment and decoration, and what that actually is, that tooth. So I think I would put one of these amazing ornaments on Times Square.
Do you have a favorite quote?
Yes, I do. My favorite quote concerns the dating of what we've been talking about, the Middle to Upper Paleolithic transition. And my colleague, well, he wasn't really a colleague because he was dead before I knew him, but he was a very famous Harvard professor called Hallam Mobius, and he said, "Time alone is the lens that will throw it into focus." And that means that the dating is the most important thing that we can do to understand how Neanderthals disappeared and how Homo sapiens took over and became the only species on Earth. So time alone is the lens. I love that. I love that quote, and I always have. And there's another one too. Maybe you don't want another one, though.
No,
But
go
anyway.
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, the other one I can't really quote wholly, but it's from a Danish antiquarian called Rasmus Neerup, and it's just a quote in which he's bemoaning the fact that everything that comes down to us from Christendom is kept in a deep fog. We can't possibly know the age of it. We can only guess. And he was writing that in the early 1800s because he didn't know the age of the earth. He didn't know how old humans were. He had no idea because all he had was the Bible, and he knew that the Bible wasn't telling the whole truth. So I always feel for Rasmus Neerup because I wish he could come to the 21st century and we could show him how we tell the age of things and how we date things. Bless him. I think he would be super excited if he were here today.
Yeah, imagine that. I don't know if it's possible to say such a thing, but who would you say is the best of all time, meaning the best archaeologist of our time?
There have been so many. But if I could be a little bit personal here, and biased, I really, my dad's an archaeologist, and I really admire him and his work because of the sheer doggedness of his work. He works in Southeast Asia. He stopped excavating 3 or 4 years ago now. He worked from 1968 until 2019. Every year, he would go and excavate and dig in sites in Thailand, for the most part, to find out more about the origins of domesticated agriculture, rice, and then the build up to the state, to the complex Iron Age, Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and then the build up of the state of Angkor in Cambodia. And so I really admire his intellectual honesty and doggedness and what he did. And that has inspired me to try and do a better job in what I do. So there are many, many great archaeologists, but yeah, my bias is to talk about my dad,
What's his full name?
Charles Higham.
Um, what would you have liked to know when you were 20?
God, man, these are really tough questions. Wow. Well, I think in terms of science and the research that I do, I'd have liked to have known that humans and other now extinct forms of humans did actually interbreed. I think we've wasted a lot of time working it out, and we could have been much cleverer. We could have really worked it out. And I think that if I could, 2020 vision looking back, I think to know that humans could interbreed with other humans and we weren't unique was actually a bit of a mistake. And I think I'd have liked to have known that a lot longer ago than I did now.
What's your newest, biggest insight?
Yeah. The newest, biggest insight would be that tiny pieces of bone that we find in archaeological sites that we thought were completely non-informative can actually tell us a great deal if we extract the proteins from them, sequence those proteins. We can actually identify the bones to their proper species or genus. And we can use this method to find tiny pieces of human bone from some of the most difficult environments in the world, in places like island Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea, where there's so much excitement building about the story of human evolution, and we can thereby identify tiny pieces of human to then genetically sequence, date, and understand all about their ancient human story and what it means for us today. So I think that's one of the really most exciting things that I can think of at the moment.
A controversial opinion, I believe, what nobody else does.
Yeah, so I think that, and I have actually shared this at various conferences, and some people have said that they think it's something that holds water. I think that Denisovans, because we always thought that Denisovans, that Homo sapiens were the only group that got to Australia on Australasia. But I think there is increasingly evidence that suggests that Denisovans also got over into what was a supercontinent of Australasia, joined with Papua New Guinea and those big islands to the north. And I think that it's very, very potentially likely that Denisovans also got over there, which means that we have to rethink our interpretation of the idea that it was only Homo sapiens that were capable of those kind of ocean voyages. And if it's true, then it would be really cool. But at the moment, we don't have any actual evidence. Suffice it to say that there is genetic evidence in living people that maybe means that it's a possibility. But that would be a really cool thing to prove and show. But I think it's a controversial idea.
What do you see as the biggest problem in archaeology right now?
I think it's often people that hold on to an idea and don't give it up, even in the face of new evidence. There is a lot of time and pain and suffering and waste made by people in the field that can't admit that they were wrong, and they tend to hold on to things and defend it even when it's indefensible. And I think that science would benefit in my field from more people being willing to change their mind and admit that they were wrong.
How would you spend $10 billion to make the world a better place?
Would I spend 10 billion?
How would you spend
How would
10
I?
billion to
Oh,
make the world a better place?
Oh, I think it. I can't say one thing. There'd be lots of different things. I mean, there would be efforts to mitigate climate change in the third world and global south. That is the most important thing that we could do. So most of the money would probably go to that. I'm a massive believer in the transformative power of education, and so I would also try and spend money on giving people opportunities, to give them the opportunity to study and to go to some of the great universities of the world and learn to do new things, and then to return to take back that knowledge to the places from which they originally came. But I think that the overwhelming crisis we have on at the moment is climate, and it scares me a great deal. And so I think that the vast majority of the money would go on mitigation and making climate adaptability more possible for people in deprived and difficult areas.
What do you think of Charles Darwin?
Oh my God, amazing! I remember going to Down House where Charles Darwin lived and worked with his family, and walking along in the gardens and visiting that place was just so amazing and so evocative. I mean, what a fantastic scientist! And one of the things I love about Wallace and Darwin was that whilst they were both working towards the same theory, and they discovered that, well, Darwin, to his shock, discovered that Wallace had basically reached the same conclusions that he had. They were amicably able to settle their differences and publish their work at a very similar time and present their work together. I think nowadays it's totally different. But scientists would be fighting each other to be the first, and that would be, it would be a rather nasty situation. So I admired Charles Darwin so much, and I also feel for him and the way that he had so much pain and suffering in his life, with children dying from diseases that nowadays we could fix. And of course, we know that this was one of the things that helped him to coalesce his ideas. This idea of survival of the fittest. Although, of course, that wasn't his. He didn't coin that phrase. But yeah, I mean, I just have incredible admiration for the fact that he was able to slowly coalesce these ideas together and publish such an incredible piece of work, and then a later equally good piece of work later on in his life. So yes, incredible.
Well, thank you, Tom, for taking the time. If you want to know more about Tom and his insights and ideas, um, Get his book, The World Before Us, The New Science Behind Our Human Origins. Thank you very much.